May 28, 1918, 4:45 a.m. Cantigny, France. In the pre-dawn darkness, Captain George C. Marshall, future architect of Allied victory in World War II, checked his watch one final time. The 28th Infantry Regiment, 1st Division, United States Army, crouched in their assault trenches 200 yards from German positions. They'd been waiting for this moment since arriving in France 7 months earlier. Waiting to prove that American soldiers could fight. Waiting to show the exhausted French and skeptical British that the doughboys weren't just fresh reinforcements, but warriors who could win battles. What Marshall and the 3,500 men preparing to go over the top didn't know was that they were about to write the opening chapter of American military dominance in the 20th century. This small village, barely visible through the morning mist, a collection of ruined stone buildings and shell-torn streets that wouldn't appear on most maps, would become the proving ground where American doctrine, American firepower, and American determination were tested against the most experienced army in the world. The Germans occupying Cantigny were veterans of 4 years of continuous warfare. They'd fought at Verdun, the Somme, and survived offensives that consumed entire armies. They'd watched British, French, and Russian attacks break against their defenses like waves against stone. These weren't parade ground soldiers. They were survivors who understood killing with industrial efficiency. And they were laughing at the Americans. Hauptmann Hans von Schack, commanding the 272nd Reserve Infantry Regiment defending Cantigny, had reported to division headquarters 3 days earlier. The Americans are enthusiastic but amateurish. They bunch up in their trenches. They expose themselves unnecessarily. They don't understand artillery. When we attack, it will be a turkey shoot. What von Schack didn't understand, what German high command couldn't have predicted, was that the Americans weren't trying to fight a European war. They were bringing American methods to European battlefields. Methods that would transform warfare through overwhelming material superiority, systematic planning, and a willingness to learn from failure that would make them the most dangerous opponent Germany would face. This is the story of how 3,500 men captured a village that meant nothing strategically but everything symbolically. How American artillery doctrine rewrote the rules of fire support. How a division taking its first objective would hold it against 7 counterattacks and 14 hours of continuous German shelling. And how the first American offensive victory of World War I announced that a new military power had arrived, one that would never leave. At 4:45 a.m., Marshall gave the signal. The barrage began. The 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, had arrived in France in June 1917 as the first complete American division to reach Europe. They'd been rushed across the Atlantic in a symbolic gesture to show the French and British that American help was coming. But getting soldiers to France was easy. Making them ready for modern warfare was something else entirely. The division's commander, Major General Robert Lee Bullard, was a 57-year-old veteran of the Indian Wars, the Spanish-American War, and the Philippine insurrection. He'd spent 30 years in an army that specialized in small unit actions against irregular forces. The Western Front was industrial warfare on a scale that no American officer had ever experienced. The numbers were staggering. The German Spring Offensive, launched in March 1918, had thrown 76 divisions, nearly 1 million men, at British and French positions in a desperate bid to win the war before American reinforcements could arrive in force. In 5 weeks, the Germans had advanced 40 miles, their deepest penetration since 1914. French casualties exceeded 100,000. British casualties approached 150,000. The Germans had gotten to within 75 miles of Paris. Every available French and British unit was committed to stopping the advance. There were no reserves. That's when General Ferdinand Foch, newly appointed as Supreme Allied Commander, looked at the American division's training behind the lines and made a decision that would define American military identity. The Americans would attack, not in a quiet sector, not in a supporting role. The 1st Division would conduct an independent offensive operation to capture Cantigny, a village on high ground overlooking German supply lines. The objective was tactically useful. German artillery observers on the heights could see Allied positions for miles. But the real purpose was psychological. The Germans needed to see that American troops could take ground and hold it. The French and British needed to see that the Americans weren't just numbers, but effective combat forces. And the Americans needed to prove to themselves that they belonged on the same battlefield as armies that had been fighting since 1914. Brigadier General Beaumont Buck, commanding the 2nd Brigade that would conduct the assault, received his orders on May 23rd. 5 days to plan and execute the division's first offensive operation. In those 5 days, American staff officers discovered how much they didn't know about modern warfare. The 28th Infantry Regiment, chosen to lead the attack, numbered 3,500 men organized in 3 battalions. They'd been in the trenches near Cantigny for 3 weeks, conducting raids and patrols. They'd taken casualties from German artillery and snipers. They'd learned that war on the Western Front meant mud, rats, lice, and constant fear of the next shell. But they'd never conducted a major assault. They'd never coordinated with supporting artillery. They'd never experienced the devastating German counterattacks that had destroyed hundreds of Allied offensives. Colonel Hanson Ely, commanding the 28th Infantry, was 46 years old with no combat experience. His regimental staff had been assembled only months earlier. Most company commanders were first lieutenants or captains with less than a year of service. The platoon leaders were second lieutenants fresh from officer training schools. The planning for Cantigny assault revealed how thoroughly the American Army had studied French and British methods, and how willing they were to improve on them. Captain George Marshall, serving as the division's operations officer, had spent months observing French offensive tactics. What he saw appalled him. French attacks relied on complex timetables that collapsed the moment contact was made with the enemy. Artillery barrages followed rigid schedules regardless of infantry progress. Units attacked on narrow fronts that allowed German machine guns to create impassable killing zones. And coordination between infantry, artillery, and supporting arms was minimal. Marshall designed something different for Cantigny. The attack would use overwhelming artillery support, far more than French doctrine prescribed. The barrage would be flexible, responsive to infantry needs rather than following a predetermined schedule. And most radically, the attack would be supported by French-supplied tanks, 12 Schneider Ca-1 heavy tanks that would advance with the infantry to suppress German strongpoints. The Americans would also employ French-supplied flamethrower teams and had acquired 8 Stokes mortars for close infantry support. This wasn't just an infantry assault. It was a combined arms operation integrating every available weapon system. The artillery plan was unprecedented. American and French guns, 386 pieces total, ranging from 75mm field guns to 280mm siege howitzers, would bombard Cantigny for 1 hour before the assault. The bombardment would deliver 3,000 shells on German positions in the village, roughly 1 shell for every yard of German trench. Then, as the infantry advanced, the artillery would create a rolling barrage, a moving curtain of explosions 100 yards ahead of the attackers that would suppress German defenders and destroy strongpoints. The infantry would advance in 3 waves, each wave 100 yards behind the previous one, following the barrage like surfers riding a steel wave. The plan was brilliant on paper, but the 28th Infantry had never practiced advancing behind a rolling barrage. They'd never coordinated with tanks. Most men had never seen a flamethrower, and they were about to do all of this against German defenders who'd been perfecting defensive tactics for 4 years. German intelligence knew an attack was coming. Aerial reconnaissance reported American troop movements. Prisoners taken in raids described preparations. Hauptmann von Schack reinforced Cantigny with additional machine gun positions and registered his own artillery on likely approach routes. By May 27th, both sides were ready. The Americans had concentrated 3,500 assault troops, 386 artillery pieces, 12 tanks, and air support. The Germans had 1,200 men in Cantigny, supported by artillery and with plans for immediate counterattacks from reserve positions. On the evening of May 27th, Colonel Ely assembled his battalion commanders for final orders. His message was simple. Tomorrow we attack at 6:45 a.m. We will take Cantigny. We will hold Cantigny. Do not come back without it. What none of them mentioned, what everyone understood, was that failure would confirm every European prejudice about American military capabilities. Success might not win the war, but failure would mark the American army as amateurs playing at soldiers' games. At 4:45 a.m. on May 28th, the artillery preparation began. The sound was unlike anything the Americans had experienced. 386 artillery pieces firing simultaneously created a physical shock wave that could be felt miles away. The ground trembled, the air filled with the shriek of passing shells and the thunder of impacts. In Cantigny, the German defenders experienced hell. The American and French artillery didn't just bombard the village, they systematically destroyed it. High explosive shells collapsed buildings. Shrapnel shells swept streets with thousands of steel balls. Gas shells forced defenders into masks, reducing visibility and making breathing laborious. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann, 272nd Reserve Infantry, later described the bombardment in a letter to his family. The world ended that morning. Shells fell like rain. Not scattered shots, but continuous explosions. Buildings collapsed. The dugouts shook. Men screamed, but you couldn't hear them over the bombardment. I thought, this is how we die. Buried under French soil by American shells. The American fire plan demonstrated sophisticated understanding of artillery effects. The first 15 minutes targeted German artillery positions, attempting to neutralize counter-battery fire. The next 30 minutes pounded German trenches and strong points in Cantigny. The final 15 minutes shifted to German reserve positions and communication trenches to isolate the village. At 6:40 a.m., 5 minutes before the assault, the barrage lifted from the German front lines and began rolling forward at 100 yards per minute. The timing was critical. The infantry needed to advance close enough to the barrage to hit German positions before defenders could man their machine guns, but not so close that they'd be killed by their own artillery. At 6:45 a.m., whistles blew along the American trenches. Over the top. Move out. First Lieutenant John Curry, 28th Infantry, 2nd Battalion, was one of the first over the parapet. 26 years old, West Point class of 1915, he'd been in France for 7 months. This was his first attack. The barrage moved ahead of us like a curtain. Smoke, dust, and explosions. We advanced in waves, rifles at port arms. The training took over. You didn't think, you just moved. 100 yards. 200 yards. Still no German fire. The initial advance went exactly according to plan. The 3 battalions advanced in waves with parade ground precision. The rolling barrage churned German positions. The 12 French tanks rumbled forward, their 75mm guns engaging any German strongpoint that showed resistance. At 6:52 a.m., 7 minutes into the assault, German machine guns opened fire. The defenders who survived the bombardment had recovered faster than expected. MG-08 machine guns, protected in concrete pillboxes, began sweeping no man's land with interlocking fire. The Germans had positioned their weapons brilliantly, each covering the other's fields of fire, creating zones where advancing troops faced fire from multiple angles. The Americans learned their first lesson about industrial warfare. Artillery could suppress, but not destroy determined defenders. Men started falling. The neat waves began to fragment as troops sought cover. This was the moment that would define the battle's outcome. In previous French and British attacks, this was where assaults broke down. Units would go to ground under machine gun fire. Officers would be killed. The attack would stall, then collapse into desperate attempts to withdraw. The Americans kept moving. Company commanders, seeing their men hesitate, stood up and led by example. "Follow me," became the most common command. Platoon leaders identified machine gun positions and directed fire. Squads used leapfrog tactics, one element providing covering fire while another advanced. Most critically, the battalion commanders had direct communication with supporting artillery. When Company E ran into a German strongpoint at the village edge, the company commander sent a runner to battalion headquarters. Within 3 minutes, American 75mm guns were pounding the position. The strongpoint disappeared in explosions. Private Harold Pierce, Company G, 28th Infantry, described the advance. We were scared. Everyone was scared. But we'd been told that Germans couldn't handle American aggressiveness. So we kept going. When we got stuck, we called for artillery. When that didn't work, we flanked them. The training might have been short, but it was good. We knew what to do. The French tanks proved less effective than hoped. Of 12 tanks, 3 broke down before reaching German lines. 4 were knocked out by German artillery. The remaining 5 penetrated into Cantigny, but couldn't coordinate effectively with infantry. Still, their presence suppressed German defenders and created psychological shock. By 7:15 a.m., 30 minutes into the assault, lead elements of the 28th Infantry were in Cantigny. By 7:40 a.m., the village center was secured. By 8 a.m., the regiment had reached its final objectives on the far edge of the village. The attack had succeeded. Cantigny was American. Casualties in the assault phase were relatively light by Western Front standards. 127 killed, 356 wounded. The Germans lost approximately 200 killed and 225 captured. The rest of the garrison had withdrawn under the American advance. Colonel Ely sent a message to brigade headquarters. Objective taken. Consolidating positions. Request orders. The response came from General Bullard himself. Hold at all costs. German counterattacks expected. The Americans had taken Cantigny. Now they had to keep it. At 8:30 a.m., German artillery opened fire on Cantigny with an intensity that made the American bombardment seem gentle by comparison. The Germans had registered their guns on the village over preceding weeks. Every building, every street, every possible position was pre-sighted. The bombardment was systematic annihilation. German 77mm field guns engaged American infantry positions. 150mm howitzers collapsed buildings being used as strong points. 210mm siege guns cratered streets and destroyed dugouts. The Americans discovered their second hard lesson. Holding ground was harder than taking it. The positions they occupied had just been thoroughly destroyed by their own artillery. There were no intact trenches, no prepared bunkers, no overhead cover. They had to create defensive positions under continuous German fire. Sergeant Michael Donaldson, Company E, 28th Infantry, later recalled, "We used German dugouts when we could find them intact. Otherwise, we dug like our lives depended on it, which they did. The shelling was constant. Every few seconds, another explosion. We couldn't move, couldn't get water or ammunition forward, just huddled in shell holes and prayed." At 9:15 a.m., the first German counterattack came from the north. 2 companies from the 272nd Reserve Infantry, approximately 300 men, advanced in dense formations, attempting to overwhelm American positions through speed and numbers. The Americans had set up their defensive line with interlocking fields of fire, copying the German tactics they'd just overcome. Browning automatic rifles, Chauchat light machine guns, and concentrated rifle fire cut down the German assault before it reached American lines. The attack collapsed within 10 minutes with heavy German casualties. But the Germans weren't finished. At 10:05 a.m., a second counterattack came from the east. 3 companies this time, approximately 450 men, supported by artillery that walked just ahead of the advancing infantry. This attack penetrated American positions. German troops reached the village center in hand-to-hand fighting. For 30 minutes, the battle devolved into savage close-quarters combat. Americans fought with rifles, pistols, bayonets, grenades, and entrenching tools in ruined buildings and shell craters. Lieutenant George Roselle, Company F found himself commanding a mixed group of 40 men from 3 different companies after his battalion command structure had been disrupted by shelling. His after-action report captured the chaos. Germans were everywhere. No front line, just fighting in all directions. We held one building, they held the one next door. You threw grenades through windows and hoped they didn't throw them back. The smoke was so thick you couldn't see 20 feet. The Americans held. The German counterattack was beaten back by 10:45 a.m. with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The Germans left 78 dead in American positions. American casualties in repelling the attack: 45 killed, 93 wounded. The pattern continued throughout the day. German counterattacks at 11:30 a.m., 1:15 p.m., 3:20 p.m., 4:45 p.m., and 6:30 p.m. Each attack was repulsed. Each attack cost both sides dearly. Each attack tested American resolve. The artillery fire never stopped. German gunners pounded Cantigny for 14 continuous hours. American counter-battery fire tried to suppress German guns, but couldn't silence them. The village became a moonscape of overlapping craters. Every structure was reduced to rubble. The dead couldn't be recovered. They lay where they fell, American and German bodies mixed in the ruins. By late afternoon, the 28th Infantry was approaching its breaking point. Casualties exceeded 50% in some companies. Ammunition was running low. Water was gone. Medical supplies were exhausted. The regiment had been in continuous combat for 12 hours with no relief. At 5:30 p.m., Colonel Ely sent an urgent message to brigade. Regiment is spent. Request permission to withdraw to secondary positions. The response from General Bullard was immediate and uncompromising. Hold Cantigny. Reinforcements coming. Under no circumstances withdraw. The reinforcements were 2 companies from the 18th Infantry Regiment, approximately 400 fresh troops. They reached Cantigny at 7:15 p.m., moving through German artillery fire that killed 40 men before they reached American lines. But their arrival gave the defenders renewed strength. The Germans launched their final counterattack at 6:30 p.m., a 2-battalion assault, approximately 800 men, representing the last available reserves. They advanced in the fading light behind a creeping barrage, determined to retake Cantigny before darkness made coordination impossible. The attack reached American forward positions. German infantry penetrated into the village in company strength. For an hour, the battle hung in balance. If the Germans pushed through, Cantigny would be lost, and the first American offensive would end in defeat. The Americans held. Reinforcements from the 18th Infantry counterattacked into German penetration. Machine gun fire from positions on the flanks caught German troops in crossfire. American artillery, which had been firing support missions all day despite fatigue and ammunition shortages, delivered devastating defensive barrages on German assembly areas. By 8 p.m., the German attack had failed. By 9 p.m., German forces withdrew to their original positions. By 10 p.m., firing had reduced to occasional artillery exchanges and sniper fire. Cantigny remained in American hands. The Battle of Cantigny officially ended on May 31st when the 1st Division was relieved after 3 days of holding the captured village. Final casualty figures told the story of modern warfare's brutality. American casualties, 1,067 total. 199 killed in action, 868 wounded. The 28th Infantry suffered over 30% casualties. Some companies lost 60% of their strength. German casualties, estimated 1,400 total. Approximately 300 killed, 875 wounded, 225 captured. For capturing and holding a village of no strategic importance, a place that wouldn't affect the outcome of the war, both sides paid a terrible price. Yet Cantigny mattered enormously for reasons that transcended tactics or territory. The Americans had proven they could fight. They'd taken an objective against experienced German troops. They'd held it against 7 determined counterattacks. They demonstrated understanding of combined arms warfare, coordination with artillery, and the determination to succeed that European armies had shown for 4 years. More importantly, they'd announced that American military methods were different and effective. The overwhelming artillery support, the aggressive tactics, the refusal to yield ground, and the systematic approach to problem-solving on the battlefield were distinctly American approaches that would define U.S. military operations for the next century. General Foch sent a congratulatory telegram. The success at Cantigny, complete and finally executed, is a source of satisfaction and pride for the whole French army. Congratulations to General Bullard and to the American troops who have conducted themselves in battle like seasoned veterans. General Pétain, commanding French armies, visited the 1st Division on June 2nd to personally congratulate the troops. His message acknowledged what Cantigny represented. You have shown that American soldiers can fight and win against Germany's best. This is the beginning of America's contribution to victory. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the Germans. Cantigny demonstrated that the Americans weren't the untrained rabble that German intelligence had reported. Ludendorff, directing German operations, ordered immediate reassessment of American capabilities. His June 1st report to the Kaiser was sobering. The Americans fought well at Cantigny. They demonstrated good tactics, excellent artillery support, and determination in defense. We can no longer assume that American divisions are inferior to French or British units. The psychological impact reverberated through the German army. If 3,500 Americans could take and hold a fortified position against repeated counterattacks, what would happen when hundreds of thousands of Americans attacked? Cantigny established patterns that would define American military operations through 2 world wars and beyond. Overwhelming firepower. The ratio of artillery to infantry at Cantigny, 1 gun for every 9 attackers, was unprecedented. Americans would never abandon the doctrine that firepower saves lives. Combined arms. The integration of infantry, artillery, tanks, and aircraft at Cantigny became the template for American operational art. Aggressive tactics. The willingness to advance under fire, to attack rather than defend, to take casualties to achieve objectives. These became hallmarks of American military culture. Logistical superiority. The Americans fired more artillery ammunition in 1 day at Cantigny than some European armies could accumulate in weeks. Material superiority would become America's advantage. Many of the officers who fought at Cantigny would shape American military doctrine for decades. Colonel George C. Marshall became Army Chief of Staff in World War II and architect of the Marshall Plan. Major Theodore Roosevelt Jr., who coordinated artillery support, would land at Utah Beach on D-Day as a brigadier. General Lieutenant Clarence Hubner, commanding a machine gun company, would command the 1st Infantry Division at Omaha Beach. The 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, would fight in every major American campaign. World War II, North Africa, Sicily, Normandy, across France and Germany, Vietnam, and Iraq. Every soldier who would wear the Big Red One patch would know about Cantigny, the place where the division proved itself. Today, Cantigny is a quiet village in the Picardy region of France. The American cemetery nearby contains graves of soldiers who fell in the battle. A memorial erected by the 1st Infantry Division Society stands at the village center, commemorating the first American offensive victory. The inscription reads simply, "Here on May 28, 1918, soldiers of the 1st Division attacked and captured the village of Cantigny, the first American offensive victory of the Great War." But Cantigny meant more than first victory. It meant that a new military power had announced its arrival, that American methods, industrial strength, overwhelming firepower, aggressive tactics, and absolute determination would define 20th century warfare. The Germans had laughed at the Americans before Cantigny. They didn't laugh afterward. By November 1918, 42 American divisions would be in France, over 2 million men, conducting offensives that would help break German resistance. The road from Cantigny to the Argonne Forest to final victory ran through that small village captured on a May morning. Captain Marshall, filing his after-action report 3 days after the battle, concluded with an observation that captured Cantigny's significance. The 28th Infantry executed its first offensive operation with success. Casualties were heavy, but acceptable. The regiment demonstrated that American troops, properly trained and supported, can achieve objectives against German forces. This engagement should serve as proof to our allies that American divisions can contribute meaningfully to Allied offensive operations. History would prove Marshall correct. Cantigny wasn't just a village captured. It was the announcement that American arms had arrived on the world stage and would dominate it for the next century.